You're listening to the TOEFL Podcast, Episode 13. This is the TOEFL Podcast, Episode 13. I'm your host, Dr. Jeff McQuillan, coming to you from the Center for Educational Development in Los Angeles, California. And a Happy New Year to you. We are back on our regular weekly schedule of podcasts. Today's podcast is going to be a lecture. As many of you know, the TOEFL exam includes conversations as well as sample lectures and questions about the lecture. And the new TOEFL examination, what's called the Next Generation TOEFL, which will be coming, if it hasn't come to your country already, will be coming in the next year to most places. This is an internet based exam, and it includes in the listening section several long lecture sections. So today we're going to do a college lecture, a short, but the beginning of a lecture similar to the kind that will be on the TOEFL examination. Let's get started. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Dr. Robert Lambert, and I am your guest speaker today. As I am sure that Dr. McQuillan told you, I am a visiting scholar from another university. Today, we are going to talk about history, or more exactly, historiography. Historians use many different types of evidence in their work. These include a variety of sources, including written or printed information, interviews for contemporary historians, inscriptions, artwork, and findings from archaeology. Some of the most important names in the development of how historians go about doing their work were Leopold Ranke and A.J.P. Taylor. These historians changed the way we look at history and how we go about writing it. Of course, historians have been debating the best way to write history since the ancient Greeks. The first Greek historian, Herodotus, who we sometimes call the father of history, had his own rather peculiar approaches to history and its writing. Other ancient historians, including Thucydides and Tacitus, also wrote about historiography, although the methods they used would certainly not pass muster today. It is important to distinguish between the historian and the chronicler. A chronicler typically records advances as they happen, and often are simple listings of all the names, dates, and events. A history, on the other hand, is a systematic attempt to understand underlying causes and reasons for historical development. I'll answer questions in a few minutes, but let's look at the roots of historiography in the Greco-Roman context. Today we listened to a lecture, a short introduction of a lecture regarding historiography, or the study of how history is written. And the lecture begins by the professor introducing himself. He says, "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen." And ladies and gentlemen is a very formal way of saying men, or women and men. It's often used in a formal speech or in a lecture. The lecturer says that he is a guest speaker today. A guest speaker is someone who the professor invites to come and talk to your class. A speaker, of course, someone who speaks, and a guest, someone who's invited. He begins by saying, as I am sure that Dr. McQuillan told you. That expression, as I am sure, or as I am sure that, expresses the idea that he is assuming that you know this information. He says that he is a visiting scholar from another university, which means he's a professor at another university, and perhaps for that semester or that year, he is visiting with at the university, working at the university for that time. Now, he says the lecture today is going to be about historiography, and then he explains that historians use many different types of evidence in their work. Evidence, evidence, is what you use to support or show that your position is correct, or it could be data that you analyze. These are all types of evidence. The types of evidence that he discusses include a variety of sources. And sources is a word you hear a lot in an academic university setting or context. Your sources are where you get your information, where you are getting what you are saying. It shouldn't, your source could be the internet, although it shouldn't be just the internet. Certainly not someone else's paper. That's not a good source. But other scholars and what we would call original sources that come from the original time in the case of history. These include a number of different things for historians. One of the types of sources or variety of sources is interviews for contemporary historians. The word contemporary is not related to temporary. Contemporary means of this current time, going on right now. At the same time, it can also mean. Whereas, of course, temporary means for a short time. But contemporary means going on right now, in the modern day. Other types of evidence include inscriptions. An inscription is a writing on a monument or a building, and other findings from archaeology. And archaeology, of course, is the study of what we would find in the ground, often buried about a civilization. The professor mentioned some important names in the development of how historians go about doing their work. The expression "go about" is it's not informal, but it's another way of saying how they do their work. To go about means that you are in the act of, you are in the process of. It puts the emphasis on the actual doing. And it is followed by a verb in the ing form. So you hear go about doing their work, doing. Later in that same paragraph, it says that these historians changed the way we look at history and how we go about writing it. Once again, writing ing form of the verb. The professor then says that historians have been debating the best way to write history since the ancient Greeks. To debate, D-E-B-A-T-E, means to argue, to discuss. Usually you disagree with someone else when you debate them. They've been writing about this topic since the ancient Greeks, which means since the time of the ancient Greeks. The first Greek historian, the professor says, is Herodotus, called the father of history, and he had his own rather peculiar approaches to history. The expression rather peculiar. Well, peculiar is somewhat strange, odd, different, unique. Those are all ways of describing peculiar. Rather peculiar just means very peculiar. So, for example, you can say it's rather cold outside. You mean it's very cold outside. Maybe unusually cold outside. The professor mentions a couple of other ancient historians, Thucydides and Tacitus, Greek and a Roman historian. He says the methods that they used would certainly not pass muster today. Notice the use of would here. Although the methods they used would, it's what we call a conditional verb. They would not pass muster if they were used today, is the implication. The expression to pass muster, that's two words, pass and then muster, M-U-S-T-E-R, means that it's sort of an old-fashioned expression. It means to be approved. To pass muster means that it is acceptable for today, in this case. Finally, the professor distinguishes between a historian and a chronicler, and he explains that a chronicler records advances as they happen. To record, of course, here means to write down. Advances mean changes or progress that's made in a history, in a place, a civilization. These chronicles, as they're called, and a chronicler writes something called a chronicle. If you heard of the movie Chronicles of Narnia, a new movie out, that is about another way of saying the history, but the listing of events that happened. Listings are, of course, just a list of 1, 2, 3, 4 different things that happened. History, on the other hand, is not just a list of things, but it's an attempt, a systematic attempt to understand underlying causes. The word systematic means that it's done in a very complete, organized way. And underline, U-N-D-E-R-L-Y-I-N-G, underlying causes, means the root causes or the most important causes, the main causes, the ones that are original or began everything. That's underlying causes. Now let's listen to the lecture, this time at a native rate of speech. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Dr. Robert Lambert, and I am your guest speaker today. As I'm sure that Dr. McQuillan told you, I am a visiting scholar from another university. Today we are going to talk about history, or more exactly, historiography. Historians use many different types of evidence in their work. These include a variety of sources, including written or printed information, interviews for contemporary historians, inscriptions, artwork, and findings from archaeology. Some of the most important names in the development of how historians go about their work were Leopold Ranke and A.J.P. Taylor. These historians changed the way we look at history and how we go about writing it. Of course, historians have been debating the best way to write history since the ancient Greeks. The first great Greek historian, Herodotus, who we sometimes call the father of history, had his own rather peculiar approaches to history and its writings. Other ancient historians, including Thucydides and Tacitus, also wrote about historiography, although the methods they used would certainly not pass muster today. It is important to distinguish between the historian and the chronicler. A chronicler typically records advances as they happen, and often are simple listings of all the names, dates, and events. A history, on the other hand, is a systematic attempt to understand underlying causes and reasons for historical development. I'll answer a few questions, but first, let's look at the roots of historiography in the Greco-Roman context. Now let's ask a few comprehension questions. Question number 1. In the professor's opinion, the Greek Herodotus would be classified as A. Historian, B. Chronicler, C. Archaeologist, or D. Parent. The correct answer is A. Historian. Remember that in the middle part of the lecture, the professor said historians have been debating the best way to write history since the ancient Greeks, and the first great Greek historian, Herodotus, who was called the father of history. So therefore, the correct answer is A, historian, not chronicler, not archaeologist. The answer parent, if you heard father and didn't quite understand, you might have said parent, but of course, we don't here mean a actual father. We mean a father in the sense of the beginning, or the person who begins something, who creates something. The second question, which of the following would be unique to historians writing about recent events? A. Archaeological findings, B. Documents, C. Inscriptions, or D. Interviews. The correct answer is D. Interviews. The question asks you what is unique, or what would be unique, meaning it would only be used by historians, but not any historian, historians specifically writing about recent events. Someone writing, for example, now about the history of the 1980s or 1990s. This would be recent events. Well, if you remember from the lecture, the different types of evidence the professor cited, one of them was interviews for contemporary historians. And contemporary means of the current time or of the recent time. So the correct answer here would be D, interviews. Archaeological findings, A. Documents, B. Inscriptions, C. Could also be used in some way, I suppose, by a contemporary historian, except perhaps archaeological findings. But most historians can use these. Those are not unique to those writing about recent events. That's all we have time for on today's TOEFL podcast. Be sure to come back again next week. Remember our other podcasts, English as a Second Language podcast at ESLPod13.com. And we now have a new addition to the ESL podcast called English Cafe, where we talk about American culture and other contemporary events, things going on right now, contemporary. So you might want to listen to that as well by going to the ESLPod.com website. From Los Angeles, I'm Jeff McQuillan. Thanks for listening. TOEFL Podcast is a production of the Center for Educational Development in Los Angeles, California. Copyright 2005. TOEFL is a registered trademark of the Educational Testing Service, which does not endorse and was not involved in the production of this podcast.